Welcome to the WUDC Distinguished Speaker Lectures. In these talks, we aim to spotlight exceptional speakers with unique perspectives on the world. Each talk consists of 3 elements. The speaker will present their topic and the research, work, or experience in the field. The speaker will connect the topic to debating, and a brief Q&A section that will wrap up the talk. The first few episodes all revolve around gender and feminism and are organized in cooperation with the Gender Open Competition. Today, our speaker is Camara Stokes Hudson. Camara is a dedicated advocate for Black children and families. After graduating from the University of Vermont with a BS in Human Development and Family Science, Camara worked on staff as a policy researcher, advocate, and presenter for organizations including the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation and Connecticut Voices for Children, and as a research intern for the Children's Defense Fund and Vermonters for Criminal Justice Reform. Her career has been focused on issues of racial justice and children's rights, including issues of conditions of confinement, exclusionary, disciplinary school climate, and access to race or ethnicity data in education and juvenile justice context. Camara currently is a JD candidate at the NYU School of Law, where she is a public interest co-chair of the Black Allied Law Students Association, and starting in the fall of 2020, the co-director of the Suspension Representation Project, which matches law students with students in New York City public schools who are in need of representation in suspension hearings. In the debating context, she was also the CA of NAUDC, the North American Women, USUDC, PanAms, and numerous other local and regional tournaments, and she also broke top at the Cambridge Ivy. Camara's talk is titled Let Her Learn, Using Critical Race Theory to Understand the Disproportionate Rates of Girls of Color Removed from American Schools and the Movement to Get Them Back In. I'm Dan Lab. I'm going to host the talks. Notes are going to be in the channel, so if you like the content, please subscribe to it later. And without further ado, I'm happy to invite Camara to start the talk.
Great, Dan, thank you so much for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity to talk today about some of my research. Debating has been a large part of my life. I've debated for 13 years now. And so the way that I came to a lot of this work was through debate. And I think my love of education largely comes from my love of debating. And so this feels very connected. All of this work feels very connected to me, so I thank you. I'm going to share my screen and then I'll get started. Perfect. Great. So my project, or my title, my presentation today will be largely about the epidemic levels of Black women and girls predominantly, but also Latinx girls and Asian girls in the United States who are being suspended and expelled from schools. And trying to use critical race theory, which is one of the ways, which is a theory that can be used to understand race-based interactions, but also systemic analysis within the United States, to try and understand some of those disproportionate rates, specifically about Black girls, but also I think a lot of the analysis can be extrapolated to girls of color as well. So I'm going to get started pretty quickly with a video, if it will play. One moment. So the Let Her Learn campaign is a campaign started by the National Women's Law Center and used by a range of other groups within the United States to address the experiences of Black girls within American schools. So just as, and I wanted to use that just kind of as a quick beginning to talk about the girls that I'm going to talk about today and some of the experiences that they've had, and just as a quick roadmap. So I'm going to do a brief introduction to critical race theory. I think it's useful in terms of debate. I think that it is something that kind of is like thrown around in debate context. Often people will use things like intersectionality, but not really know what that means. People will refer to things like contact theory, right? A lot of these things are from and related to critical race theory, but I find that there is a lack of conversation about really what critical race theory is and how it can be applied to debate context and how it can be used. And then I'm going to talk about my own research, which is about understanding the school to prison pipeline and the place that Black girls have in it. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the movement that exists to protect those girls. Great. So who am I? I am Camara Stokes Hudson. I really think it's really important when we're talking about identity to name our identity. So I identify very publicly as a Black queer woman. I was born in New York City, but raised in Washington, D.C. I am a child of public schools. I attended public schools for the vast majority of my life. I have a bachelor's of science from yet another public university, from the University of Vermont. And I'm currently a JD candidate at the New York University School of Law, as was talked about before. I've been a debater for 13 years, and debate has a lot to do with my relationship to education. I was not a kid who was very involved in things prior to myself joining debate. I was not someone who was good at sports. I was not particularly talented at anything else, and experienced a lot of alienation because of that. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about Black experiences of Black girls in schools are things that I experienced myself, that people who were close to me experienced themselves. And I think that a lot of the reason that things for me changed was because I joined debate. I found an extracurricular that I felt valued in and felt supported me and supported my intellectual development. And I think I will always see competitive debating in that lens. And I think the reason that I do so much in the debate community even now, even though I haven't debated, I don't think in 4 years, is because I have a lot of gratitude to the debating community for what it's offered me, but also realize that as an experience for youth and an experience especially for kids who might not have much access to other educational, like other positive educational experiences, that debate can be something that's really amazing and really transformative. Professionally, I am an advocate for Black children and families. I come from a long line of advocates for Black children and families, teachers, social workers, juvenile probation officers, all that worked in Black communities for Black communities. And I see that work largely as a tool to undermine white supremacy and capitalism. I see the harm done to Black families in the United States as a direct result and as a design of both white supremacy and capitalism. And I see centering them as an essential factor in resolving those disparities. My best areas of knowledge, like we said before, are in the needs of children and youth in jail, so conditions of confinement, the school to prison pipeline, and school climate issues. And then very briefly, in terms of just kind of theoretically underpinning most of my work are things like critical race theory, Black feminist theory, and queer theory. Very briefly, listing is a Black feminist tradition employed especially in the early 1900s when Black women scholars realized that there wasn't really much recording of the work that they had done and acknowledgement of the relationships that had been built within Black intellectual communities. And it's a tradition that comes in and out of style in terms of Black legal scholarship or Black scholarship broadly, but I think it's something important that I do myself. So these, for me, are the Black women scholars, organizers, mentors, and other people that have informed my work. I recommend, I'm obviously not going to name or talk about all these people, but I recommend you pause the tape, take a minute to Google them. Some of them are probably known, some of them are very close to me, some I've never met in my life, but are all incredible, exceptional women with exceptional scholarship to share. So, a brief introduction to critical race theory. Broadly speaking, critical race theory developed in the 1980s as a movement of scholars of color who sought to critique and to explore the relationship between law, race, racism, and social power in ways that existing fields like critical legal studies and liberal civil rights tradition could not or had not addressed. And so I think that there was a realization in the 80s that there was a significant amount of conversation, especially in the post-civil rights era, about the needs of Black, specifically American people, but that the scholarship was not critically engaging with the relationship between race and the systems that existed. So in the many attempts, it tried to almost colorblind the system, right? So an acknowledgement of the acknowledgement of oppression of Black people and people of color in the United States post the 1960s during the civil rights movement was largely met with this kind of color blindness approach, right? That the way to resolve racism was to remove color from people's conversations. And I think critical race theory directly undermines that and argues that the system that exists now, the system that existed in the past, are directly because of and related to our conceptions of race and our conceptions of ethnicity, and that to have a conversation about race and ethnicity that doesn't talk about that structure, or to have conversations about structures that don't talk about race and ethnicity, are incorrect, that it is a incomplete story, and therefore often leads to incomplete answers. So what are the kind of basic arguments of critical? I think the first argument that comes from critical race theory is a rejection of the standard racial progress narrative. So the narrative, I think the common narrative of racial progress in the United States is one of uplift and improvement, that over time things have gotten better, right? That we go from slavery, and then slavery ends with the Civil War, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement ends Jim Crow. Some things happen in the 70s that we can't explain. And then we have Barack Obama. And a trajectory of positivity and uplift has occurred throughout American history. Critical race theory, I think, openly rejects that idea, and instead suggests that American history, especially racial history, is much more one of reform and retrenchment. So that while reforms are sometimes won, and I'll explain to you later why they argue those reforms often happen, that reforms are oftentimes then met with a retrenchment from the dominant white class, in terms of, in an attempt to roll back those reforms or reduce the positive impact that those reforms were having. So I think the best example of this is in Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown versus Board of Education is the United States Supreme Court case that ended racial segregation in public accommodation, so public schools and other places. So Brown versus Board of Education was effectively supposed to integrate American schools, right? It was supposed to allow for schools that had been segregated for many, many years by race, ethnicity, to now be integrated. The thing is soon after Brown versus Board of Education, a series of other court cases and state Supreme Court cases effectively weakened Brown versus Board of Education, which can be seen as that retrenchment, right? That an attempt to return to the status quo. So effectively what ends up happening is there never really is that integration that is supposed to occur now more than 50 years ago, right? So my father was born before Brown versus Board of Education. There's a whole generation of children that have been born after Brown versus Board of Education. And none of us have ever really existed in schools that were truly integrated in the ways that Brown versus Board of Education suggested that we should be. So I think that's the first thing, is that it kind of rejects that conception of the standard racial progress narrative. I think the second argument that it makes is a rejection of the conception of race as a biological fixed fact, and rather, and a fixed social category, and argues rather that race is a social construction, right? And so basically what this is, or what this is meant to mean, is one, it questions the concept that I think is common amongst most people, that race, ethnicity is something that is static, true across all times, something that is completely hereditary and associated with some biological concept. While there are things that are associated with biological concepts, see ethnicity, race as a construct or as a concept really isn't as linked to biology as you would think, right? So for example, the conception of Black people as being dark-skinned, right, or universally dark-skinned is strange when you consider that many people, if you look at the latitude of the world, right, across that latitude are approximately the same color, right? And that skin color is probably much more linked to your relationships to the equator than it is to a racial or ethnic or a racial category, or a set of things that we can assume from that racial category. I think So critical race theorists would argue instead that race is largely, especially in the American context, and I think largely in the world context as well, that race is a performative identity, one whose meaning shifts not only from social context to social context to social interactions to social interaction, right? So it's very similar to the analysis of gender, right? That gender is not necessarily a biological construct that is static, but rather something much more linked to people's performances of their gender, but also social contexts and social interactions that mediate people's gender. I think the second argument that comes underneath this from critical race theorists is that largely that construction is a legal construction. Many critical race theorists, or the beginnings of critical race theory, have a large relationship to critical legal studies. Derek Bell, who's one of the founders of critical race theory, was an attorney, was a civil rights lawyer. And so I think a lot of the arguments are also legal in nature. But so critical race theory would argue that the law doesn't simply reflect people's ideas of race or people's prejudices, as I think many would argue, but rather that the law actively constructs of race and actively constructs of identity and the hierarchies that we often see. So this kind of exists in a few ways. So firstly, the law has historically employed race as a basis for group differentiation, entrenching the idea that there were in fact different races. So see things like miscegenation laws, right, which in the United States banned the ability for people who were Black to marry people who were of other races, right? And so the law has historically very explicitly created these delineations, but it also helps to create the categories themselves by legally setting forth criteria or rules for which we put people into racial categories. So the way on a birth certificate, for example, that you are assigned Black is by falling into a phenotypic and ancestral category, right? So in some ways, what the legal system is doing is saying that the ways in which we delineate race and the relevant ways in which we delineate this category are based on phenotype or based on ancestry. But also realize that the legal system then assigns meaning to those categories. So, for example, when you think about the internment of Japanese Americans, that those categories then end up having a lot of meaning, right? To be Japanese, to be Asian in those contexts, in some ways, the decision to then imprison Japanese Americans during World War II is a suggestion that those people are disloyal, that those people are somehow un-American or less American than people who are not of that descent, despite the fact that obviously, very obviously, many of the Japanese people or all of the Japanese people who were trapped in internment camps were loyal American people, right? And so in some ways, legal systems, by allowing certain things to happen, create categories and create inferences that end up impacting people in the way in which they understand their lives. And that the law then employs those structures, right, to justify certain actions. So legal arguments of Black people being inferior is used to justify legalized slavery, right? So arguing that Black people are 3/5 of a person, right, subhuman, and the legal doctrine that exists around the 3/5 compromise suggest then and justify in many ways the legalized slavery of those people, right? Because they are not actually human beings, right? If it is true that Japanese people are disloyal, right, then it is okay to lock them up if we are concerned about loyalty. And so in some ways, the law is employed, has used those meanings to structure hierarchical arrangements, right? Certain people are inferior, certain people are disloyal, certain people are untrustworthy. And you effectively then have created a social meaning without ever explicitly or with explicitly intending to, and I'll talk about that in a second because I think that's the final argument of critical race theory. This is entirely by design, but in a very, very targeted way, you have created not only a system that oppresses people, but you have likely impacted the wider social conversation that is about that oppression, and have justified it to the broader community. The third argument from critical race theory, and I talk about this quite a bit throughout my throughout the presentation, is an argument that social and historical context is essential in particular analysis of racial issues, but issues in general, right? So you can't talk about education without talking about race and the relationship between the structure of American education and the structure of the relationship between the entrance of Black children into schools after slavery, right? But also realizing that because you talk about things that in context, that not every analysis applies universally to every group of people, right? So when we talk kind of broadly about people of color, that's a dangerous set of delineations, like a dangerous category of things to make. And I realized in my presentation, my initial title, that's what I called it. And I reflected upon that later on, because I think that it's important to realize that not every analysis applies to every group of people. And it's really, really essential and really important when you're talking about critical race theory to realize that the context specific to a group's identity is essential to the analysis of their issues in relationship to a structure of power. And then I think the final tenet of critical race theory very explicitly is that you have to look to the bottom, right? So when we are talking about issues of oppression, that the people you should be asking first for solutions, the people you should be asking first to conceptualize of the problem are the people who are experiencing it most directly. I think this is largely resistant of the existing narrative of research that is largely about people from empowered institutions going into communities and asking questions and making decisions, and I think undermines that by acknowledging that the experiences that people have inside of their own lives are an expertise in and of themselves, right? So in the context of my own work, I spend quite a bit of time trying to work with youth serving groups and talk to youth and talk to young people about the experiences that they have in schools, and think that when I don't do that, when my work doesn't include young people, that I acknowledge that and acknowledge that that has to be the next step in the work that I do, because I think it's essential that the solution come from those youth. Because very, very often, I think, especially when we talk about moving from solutions that are less social to more policy creation, that we forget to ask the people who have been directly impacted whether or not that solution works for them, whether or not that solution makes sense. I think a good example in the US is the response to school safety issues putting police inside of schools. I think had anyone asked lots and lots and lots of Black kids, they would have been like, that doesn't make me feel safer inside of my school. It actually makes me feel much more afraid because of the relationship that Black American people have to the police in the United States. And so it's a good example of when an attempt to solve a problem largely created a larger problem in the future because people didn't look to the bottom. You didn't ask kids first. You didn't ask Black youth first. And so I think that's these are the large arguments of critical race theory. I think if you take anything from critical theory, it's the concept that systems aren't broken, that they're working exactly as they should. So when you look at education systems in the United States and you wonder why all of these Black kids are being suspended and expelled, and that must just be a fluke, and it must be a problem with the policy, and we should just fix everything, and that we should just go in there and reform the system, that's probably not true. That the structures of education in the United States, that many of the social and political structures that exist within the US are ones that come directly from and are built upon the subjugation of Black American people, but also Indigenous people, immigrants, Latino people, and a host of other groups of people. And so realize that as we talk about systems, that these are not just things that need to be reformed, but wholly and structurally changed. to be able to work for the people that we care about. And so in my instance, and when I talk about my work, it's largely that we have to almost completely dismantle and reform the American education system to make it one that works for all of the kids that is currently pushing out students with disabilities, students who are Black and Latinx, to make sure that they're protected, because it wasn't built for them in the first place. Some other really quick things or associated theories I think are relevant to this discussion, but also I think important for debate and I think very useful. I think so. The first one is intersectionality. This one comes up in debate rounds like every single. Y'all talk about intersectionality. You just throw the concept around like it's just like it's like salt on top of meat. Like you just like it's so confusing to me, the ways in which people talk about intersectionality. So here's my quick primer. Intersectionality is a theory first identified by Kimberly Crenshaw, but comes from a long line of Black female scholarship about the relationships between Black organizing that was largely dominated by men and the experiences of Black women, and also white feminist organizing that was dominated by predominantly white women and didn't include experiences of anyone who wasn't a white upper middle class woman. The basic argument of intersectionality, or the basic concept, refers to the experiences of overlapping or intersecting social identities and related systems of oppression, domination, or discrimination. It's the idea that multiple identities can intersect or interact with one another to create a whole that is different, not better, not worse, not more interesting than the component identities. So identities that intersect include things like gender and race, but also social class, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, age, mental disability, mental illness, physical illness, as well as other forms of identity. So for example, a Black girl who experiences something in a classroom, say an argument with a teacher, might have a different conception of that argument than, say, a Black girl who is also Muslim. She might have a different interpretation of that interaction. She might have different conceptions of her relationship to herself and to her identity than the Black girl who is a Christian. And so that's kind of the basic idea of intersectionality, is not this kind of grand theory of power. Like, I think people want to argue that it's kind of this like grander theory of power and the relationships that exist than it is. I think that very, very explicitly, it's this concept that your identities intersect to create a whole that is different from the identities you had before. It's important to realize that almost all of the scholars that talk about intersectionality, whether they come before or after Kimberly Crenshaw, are very explicit about the fact that oppression is not hierarchical, right? You can't be like the experience of oppression, whether you have one oppressed identity or many oppressed identities, is a marginalizing and negative experience regardless of who interacts with it. And so it's really hard to talk about oppression in the way that I think we often do in debate, which is the more oppressed identities you have, somehow you occupy this like almost hierarchical space in like the web of oppression, right? Like that oppression is pain, that we can't measure people's pain, we can't measure people's response to that pain, and that oppression is largely not a hierarchical concept, but rather a subjective, extremely personal experience. And that instead of it being hierarchical, you should see intersectionality as each identity intersecting with one another to generate a more complex worldview that would exist if any of us were ever able to walk through life with a singular identity. So when you think about when we think about someone with more empowered identities than anyone, so a white cisgendered man living in the United States, his identities are operating at an intersection, right? He could not experience the world with just with one of those identities, right? Like, he is not just walking through the world as a man, he is also walking through the world as a cisgendered person. He is also walking through the world as a person from the United States. And so when you talk about intersectionality, one, realize that dominant identities, so people who are of dominant classes, whatever those be, also have identities, and those identities mean something and are relevant inside of conversations, but that the worldview that they have is heavily informed by that intersectionality, right? And so that's when people start, I think, when the hierarchical conversation then comes into play, is when you are talking about certain things and certain experiences, what type of, whose voice do you then preference? What complex worldview do you preference? I'd argue that you should preference the person who has experienced that thing most closely. But it doesn't mean that other people don't have relevant relevant identities within that conversation, that they are somehow an identityless being that has no bearing on the types of conversations that we have related to social justice. I think the second thing is about interest. So the second theory is interest conversion. Interest conversion is a theory that was first identified by Derek Bell, who, like I said before, was a civil rights attorney and one of the founders of critical race theory. Derek Bell very explicitly argues that Black people in the United States really only achieve civil rights victories when and only when white and Black interests begin to converge. And at the point at which those interests diverge, you begin to see that kind of retrenchment behavior that I talked about before. So once again, I'm going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education, so I don't have to keep going back, so I'm going to talk about Brown versus Board of Education. So Brown v. Board, largely was supported because it also in some ways advanced white interests at the time as well. The civil rights abuses against Black Americans were becoming increasingly world news in the 50s. It had not reached the massive world news that it would become in the 1960s, but there was consistent talk about the subjugation of Black Americans, and desegregation would have raised the nation's prestige in world politics during the Cold War, right? And so the United States had a significant interest in reducing the amount of oppression that they exacted upon Black American people, and desegregation, especially of public schools, children, right, seems like a perfectly reasonable way to get that kind of clout, to get that kind of attention at the point at which the United States requires a significant bump in their own prestige during the Cold War. Eventually, when interests begin to diverge, the enforcement of civil rights is curtailed, right? So Brown versus Board of Education, like I said before, is later undercut by cases that sanctioned segregation for decades. And that even affirmative action triumphs that come after experience smaller scale versions of that renewed interest conversion. I think a good example of interest conversion in the present day is the war against drugs. So the war against drugs in the United States is a series of policies instituted in the 80s and 90s in an attempt to curtail what was perceived as what was argued to be a drug epidemic targeted at the large numbers of crack usage in Black communities, that included an incredibly punitive response to drug addiction and drug use. It is not the only response to drug addiction and drug use. There are other models of responding to drug addiction and drug use, but the response included large amounts of incarceration, high penalties and fines, and led to a wave of Black American people, particularly Black American men, being imprisoned basically to this day. Fast forward to the 2010s approximately, in white communities around the US, there has been a significant problem with opioid use, so the use of heroin, fentanyl, and other types of drugs. It has been very interesting to see the songs that have changed about the war on drugs in that time. White communities were very supportive of the war on drugs when it was impacting Black crack users in inner cities. Now that the conversation is about white users of heroin and fentanyl, it is largely one that has shifted away from criminalization, and the conversation has moved towards that kind of public health model for drug intervention. And so you kind of see that as interests begin to converge again, that as white communities are experiencing the externalities of the war on drugs, they themselves end up seeing themselves start to call for things like public health, a better model for drug intervention, despite the fact that Black communities had been saying that for many, many, many years. And had we just done that in the past, might have been able to avoid the opioid epidemic altogether had we had a different type of response to drug addiction and drug use in this country. So briefly, applying critical race theory to a debate motion. So this is a motion I set about a year ago now, which is this House believes that women in positions of power should only give opportunities, things like project leaderships, CA positions, and other roles to other women. So I think that interest conversion is probably less relevant in this case, and I'll talk about interest conversion again later on in this, but that the real argument that I think critical race theory can offer to this motion is one that's largely about intersectionality, and it exists largely on op. So I think that the claim that this increases the number of women in top positions, you can argue is likely to be true, right? We think that if you follow through, if many women follow through with this, that you probably will see more women existing in top positions. But it's important to ask yourself then, what is the context of women that exist inside of working spaces in the status quo, and what relationship do they have to structures of racial power in the country? So using that historical context, many, many, many women of color, particularly Black American women, have been locked out of those kind of top professional jobs for many years for a range of reasons. One, because of active discrimination, but also because of things like having been enslaved for several hundred years prior to entering the workforce, experiencing things like Jim Crow and educational marginalization that meant that many women of color don't have the opportunity to even be in the place that they're talking about. To be in the place that they're talking about. So you probably end up with kind of a large community of predominantly white but extremely privileged women at the top. But even when you're talking about places in which there are women of color to choose from, we'd argue that one of the ways in which intersectionality ends up playing out, and probably one of the most explicit ways, is kind of in that lack of understanding from white women about the ways in which Black women might be marginalized or might be isolated in those working spaces. So things like discrimination against hair type, or the ways that women talk, or Black women talk or communicate, might, even to a white woman, be a reason that that woman herself is not promotable, right? That woman herself is not someone that you could carry to the top. And so what you end up with, and I think what Gov suggests, or what Gov would suggest, is that there is a benefit to having that type of representation, right? Is that what OP can say in response is, if you accept the principle of that benefit of representation, you are in some ways avoiding a more complex and a more diverse representation of people in an attempt to just pull up other women in a way that probably locks out women of color and also men of color in a way that is substantial and relevant. So I think that's one of the ways that you can apply critical race theory to a debate motion. There are lots of motions that critical race theory could be in, you can use. There are critical analysis of everything. I just recommend you Google critical race theory and X, and I promise you, you will find something. Great, so moving on now to my own research, which is about understanding the school to prison pipeline and the place that Black girls have in it. So that's, I guess, the first part. This is the second part. Cool. So a couple of brief notes on the American education system that I think are probably important to talk about before I talk any more about American schools. American education, the US education system is one that is incredibly decentralized. We do have a federal Department of Education. That federal Department of Education has very little control over curriculums and policies on a school-to-school level. and rather states and other localities institute the vast majority of curriculum, the vast majority of policy development. This means that there is a lot of variance in terms of American schools. You can go one town over and the school system will be very different. What kids are learning is very different. And so thinking about American schools is often hard for that reason, because there's just a lot of variance in terms of what is being done. It is also the American school school system, by and large, is funded by local property taxes. This is a vestige of institutional racism and classism, which is a conversation of another day. But it means that educational quality in the United States is significantly tied to geography. So while I was working in Connecticut, I worked on largely issues of race equity in education. They largely intersect with issues of class because of the local funding realities that exist across the US, because you can literally go a town over and in one town they are spending 12,000 USD per student. In another town they are spending 48,000 USD per student. And so there are massive gaps and massive distinctions in educational quality, even in small geographic areas. And I think the last observation is that is extremely segregated by race or income. So the average white student attends a school that is 69% white. The average Latino student attends a school that is 55% or more Latinx. And the average Black student attends a school that is 47% Black. So the vast majority of kids in the US are in schools with people that look exactly like them, that look exactly like them. This is despite the fact that racial segregation in public schools was legally ended in the 1950s and that integration efforts increased through the 1970s. Retrenchment efforts, though, throughout that time, like I talked about before, led largely by white middle-class communities, has led to the public school system that we have now, which is one that is in some ways more segregated than it was 40 or 50 years ago. And so when we talk about people's experiences within school, we're also talking about experiences that are extremely segregated and extremely isolated. Cool. So some quick brief notes on terms. I recommend you to stop the video and go back to these if you want to talk more about them. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. Just general norming. When I talk about race, I'm referring to the social construction, right? I'm not talking about, sometimes people refer to things like nationality or other categories that we often also use synonymously with race. I'm simply talking about the socially constructed categories meant to group people based off of assumed shared social and biological qualities. In terms of racial categories in the United States, I'm not going to obviously read all of these. When I'm talking about Black people, though, I'm talking about people who are descendant from the native peoples of Africa, and can include African Americans who are the descendants of slaves brought to the United States, but could also include the descendants of other members of the diaspora and also of Africa who have since immigrated to the United States. When I refer to people as white, I'm referring to people who have their origins in any of the peoples of Europe. This acknowledges the fact that the current US Census requires that people who are of Middle Eastern and North African descent to also identify themselves as white, for reasons I still really don't understand. But there has been significant work to change that. And I know that many people who fall into those categories already identify themselves differently on the census by identifying their nationality in the other box. So when I talk about people who are white, I'm very specifically talking about those who have their origins in any of the original people of Europe. And then the last thing is on Latinx. When I refer to someone as Latinx, I'm referring to people who have their ethnic origins in the countries of Latin America. Latin American countries, after the entrance of European settlers and everything that happened after that, have become increasingly diverse, right? We are not simply talking about the original peoples of Latin America. And so when we refer to Latinx or Latino people, we are referring to anyone who has their ethnic origins in the countries of Latin America. That means that Latinx people can be racially diverse, right? So you can be both Black and Latino, right? So you can be Afro-Latinx. You can be Asian and Latino. Those things are not, that would not make you multiracial. It would just give you an ethnicity and a racial identity. So just quick terms. And then some other terms that I think are really relevant that people should stop and think about and talk about at other times. The only one I'm going to talk very explicitly about right now is exclusionary discipline, because I think it's a unique term to the work that I do. And I realize whenever I talk about it, people like, what is going on? Exclusionary discipline is any practice engaged in by a school official intended to discipline a student that removes a student from their educational setting. So it's a spectrum of actions or activities. So this could be as small as a timeout, so asking a kid to leave the classroom or go and visit the principal's office or whatever the school administrator is. But it could be as extreme as an arrest in school. So someone being removed from their school and taken to a prison or jail. But also includes things kind of in the middle of that spectrum, including temporary removals from school, which are called suspensions, and permanent removals from schools that are called expulsions. Cool. Why? So what is the school to prison pipeline? Give me one moment to get my notes back up. What is the school to prison pipeline? So there are many, many definitions of the school to prison pipeline, but the one that I think is best and most holistic comes from Monique Morris, who wrote the book PUSHOUT, which talks very specifically about the criminalization of Black girls within schools. And basically what she argues is that the school to prison pipeline in the US refers to a collection of policies, practices, conditions, and prevailing consciousnesses that facilitate both the criminalization of education, within educational environments, and the processes by which the criminalization results in the incarceration of youth and young adults. So basically what it is, and kind of a quicker way of explaining it, is that the school to prison pipeline is a set of things, a set of policies and practices that increase the likelihood that young people will be taken from their schools and placed in carceral settings, whether that be prison, jail, being arrested, being put on house arrest, being on probation, any of those types of criminal justice type involvement. So experiences within their schools that kind of push kids towards criminal justice involvement. So those policies can be things like the use of exclusionary discipline, like I talked about before, but also zero tolerance discipline codes and school funding for mental health supports. Practices include poor teacher preparation for classroom management. So when teachers aren't prepared to deal with conflicts in classrooms, conflicts escalate, conflicts become worse. And when conflicts escalate inside of classrooms, very often kids are punished harshly for those conflicts. For minor verbal altercations become physical fights. And so those kinds of practices inside of schools, especially the poor preparation oftentimes of teachers to manage classrooms and the poor support for teachers, not to put all of it onto teachers, for classroom management, oftentimes ends up impacting whether or not kids enter the school to prison pipeline, but also conditions within schools. So the presence of law enforcement, a school climate that is negative, racial and economic isolation, all feed into increasing the likelihood that certain types of children or certain children will go from their schools entering prisons, jails, and other types of criminal justice type involvement. And then finally, the prevailing consciousnesses that exist within schools and within society is broadly, right? So beliefs that Black boys are prone to criminality, or that Black and Latina girls are more mature than their white counterparts, can extremely impact, and I'll talk about this at length in a second, how teachers respond to students, how administrators understand an altercation that happened. All of those things come from prevailing consciousnesses that exist about certain groups of people, but also public narratives that exist outside of schools. So the belief, the American narrative of being tough on crime has significantly seeped into educational spaces within the seeped into educational spaces, increasing the amount of punitive discipline that you see. So you see more things like kids being removed from school, being suspended and expelled, than you see, say, like many people talk about experiencing, like when my mother was growing up and things like that, where like if you got in trouble, like you wrote your name on the chalkboard 25 times. You know, like there were other forms of discipline that existed before we suspended and expelled kids that were not these types of aggressive, punitive behaviors. And I would argue that a lot of that punitiveness comes from the broader narrative of being tough on crime and the conception of school behaviors as kind of that precursor to criminal behavior. So some general facts about exclusionary discipline. So these are two graphs. The one on, I guess, my left is about the percentage distribution of students receiving expulsions by race and sex. And on the right is the percentage distribution of students receiving one or more out-of-school suspensions. So expulsions, permanent removal, suspensions, temporary removal. These are nationwide. The nationwide data is deceptive for a couple of reasons, but it is probably one of the best and quickest illustrations that I can give of the disparities that exist in suspensions and expulsions. When you look at school districts individually, especially when you're talking about school districts that are majority minority or largely minority, you see these disparities exacerbated in an extremely aggressive way. So when you're looking at the graph on the left, focusing mainly on the bars to your right, which are about female enrollment and female expulsions, the light blue is the participation of Black girls, or the identification of Black girls. So Black girls are enrolled in schools at about a rate of 8%, but are expelled from schools at a rate of 10%. Expulsions are not particularly common or a particularly high rate in the US. It's higher than it certainly should be, but they are not particularly, like when you compare the number of suspensions to the number of expulsions, there are far more suspensions than there are expulsions. But even when you're talking about people who are removed from school, permanently removed from school, Black girls are overrepresented in the number of people who are, the number of girls who are expelled. When you talk about suspensions, which are temporary removals, the problem gets much worse, right? So Black girls represent 8% of enrollment, but 14% of out-of-school suspensions. The problem is significantly worse for Black boys, who represent 8% of enrollment of boys, but 25% of out-of-school suspensions. And when you talk about disproportionality kind of broadly, you'll see that the disproportionality for Black boys is exceptionally high, right? So 8% versus to 23% in terms of expulsions. But one, because my area of interest is on Black girls, but also because there's been increasing evidence over time that the rates of Black girls who are being suspended and expelled is increasing at a faster rate than the rate of Black boys who are being suspended or expelled. So very similarly, in 43 states and in Washington, D.C., Black students are arrested at school at a disproportionately high level. So Black boys are 3 times more likely than white boys to be expelled from, arrested while in school. There's very little research on arrest rates for Black girls specifically, but when research has been done on national research done, but state level research suggests that similar rates exist when you compare the rates of arrest for Black girls and the rates of arrest for white girls within schools. So what's the impact then of all this exclusionary discipline I'm talking about and the suspensions and expulsions that occur? I think the biggest impact of exclusionary discipline, and the most obvious one, is kind of lost instructional time. If you're suspended or expelled, you're sitting at home. You might get a homework packet depending on what state you live in, depending on what locality you live in, but there's a good chance that you are losing instructional time. But also realize that as children are arrested, as children are suspended, they are experiencing inconsistent educational quality. What do I mean by that? So if a child is arrested, goes to prison, enters prison, and exits prison all within a year, they might have entered and exited 2 or 3 schools, right? They would have been in their normal school, they would have been in the school inside of their prison, and then likely at an alternative school or an alternative program. And through that, they're experiencing incredibly inconsistent quality of education. And so we have to be very, very careful when we're talking about students' educational needs to realize that suspensions and expulsions, and especially in school arrests, create an incredibly inconsistent educational environment for young people, and oftentimes lead to the kinds of low achievement rates that people have when people that are talked about when people talk about students of color, largely has to do, or has something to do, with the inconsistent educational quality and the lost instructional time that they experience because of the high rates of exclusionary discipline. But also realize exclusionary discipline alienates students from educational systems and other support systems. So it is really painful to be suspended in your school. It's embarrassing and painful and traumatic to be arrested while you're in school. And it's highly likely that if you experience that, you don't want to go back to that place, right? It's unlikely that you want to be return to that school to learn, that you trust the people in that building to protect you and to treat you with decency, which increases the amount of kids that then skip school, especially when you're talking about older kids that try and drop out. And that's because they've been largely alienated from the education systems that they're in. And then finally, I think the most clear impact of the school to prison pipeline is the end of that pipeline, which is incarceration. We know for a fact that suspensions and expulsions increase the likelihood that a student will enter the juvenile justice system by about 3 times. And so there's a significant risk when you're talking about incarceration when you're talking about the school to prison pipeline, that students will not only end up arrested, right, that they will end up in jail, in prisons across the country, experiencing the horrificness of being in jail, but also at that same time being alienated from their education. I've had the opportunity to be able to teach in prisons, both mainly as a debate coach, and I can say very honestly that it is hard to learn in a prison. It is hard to get your education in a prison, even if you are in some of the best prisons in the country. And so when we incarcerate young people, we also take them away from their best chances at being able to experience a education that could change their lives and change the lives of the communities that are around them. Great. So PUSHOUT. So a couple of years ago, now more than a couple of years ago, a book called PUSHOUT, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools came out, written by a woman named Monique Morris. And this is kind of the foundation of the argument that I about Black girls that I think is relevant and important to issues of exclusionary discipline, which is that while Black boys do make up the largest share of children of color who are suspended, expelled, and arrested in schools, the current analysis of the school to prison pipeline, so the one that I presented to you all kind of generally, only obscure the experiences of not only obscure the experiences of Black girls, but also limit the conceptualization of the forces in the lives of Black girls that lead them to end up in prisons and jails. Morris additionally would argue that Black boys are penalized primarily for disciplinary reasons, so things unstated discipline codes like bringing a weapon to school or fighting, and that Black girls often are scrutinized more according to their adhesion or derivation from social norms that correspond to white middle-class definitions of femininity. I think that the 2 most explicit ways of understanding this are conceptions of Black female aggression and conceptions of Black female sexuality, which I will talk about now. Sorry. So the first conception that I think is really relevant to talk about, and also probably relevant in the debating context, and I'll talk about that at the end of this slide, is about conceptions of Black female aggression. The narrative of the angry Black woman is consistent across American culture and depicted in movies and television shows and music and anything that could possibly include Black women, oftentimes attempts to play on this trope. So that image of Black woman with her hands on her hips, lips pursed, head rolling, snapping, right? That image originates from slavery era narratives of Black women as more masculine, oftentimes to justify the fact that they were doing manual labor that many women were not doing, many white women were not doing, but was bolstered throughout the 1900s and with the advent of television, and also with government reports like the Moynihan Report, which blamed Black female independence for a range of social issues. So this narrative that Black women are angrier, are more aggressive, or sassy, whatever that is a direct derivation of a very ugly narrative about Black female aggression that derives from slavery. And so even when we talk about people as being sassy, we should be very careful about the ways in which we level those accusations against people, or level those comments against Black women especially. But in a school-based context, the stereotype often manifests for Black girls in misunderstandings or exaggerations of Black female behaviors. So a Black girl expressing her opinion, especially one that is unsolicited, might be interpreted as an aggressive behavior of insubordination, as opposed to simply children who don't know how to wait, right? That's a much more easy, or a much more likely interpretation of her behavior than attempt to be aggressive or insubordinate, than an attempt for her to, so that it's less likely that she's trying to be insubordinate. It also happens oftentimes when Black girls stand up for themselves or others. So confrontations with teachers, for example, I often experience this in debating when I correct people on how to pronounce my name. People butcher my name, especially in American debating. And oftentimes my attempts to correct people are met with this kind of like, oh, don't get so mad. And I'm like, I wasn't angry. I simply wanted to make clear that that's not my name, right? That my name is Camara, not Camara, or all of the other weird things that people have called me over the years, Tamara, Tiana, any other name of every other Black girl who has ever debated, that act of standing up for yourself, because of the conceptions of Black women as angry and as aggressive, are conceived as hyper-aggressive and negative. And I think it also experiences when Black girls experience distress or disinterest, dismay, show trauma or sadness. I think the standard understanding of the ways in which girls express trauma and negativity is that kind of internalizing model, right? Boys get angry and fight, girls go inside of themselves and experience sadness, right? So that concept of that kind of like white middle-class femininity, again, playing into our conceptions of how people react to trauma, ends up negatively impacting Black girls who, when they don't experience or respond to trauma in a certain way, when they experience distress, disinterest, dismay in a way that is more public, that is interpreted as something that is hyper-aggressive and not an expression of dismay or disinterest. I think there are kind of three implications. Very generally within discipline codes within states in the United States, there is a section called willful and defiant behavior, or sometimes it's called like other disciplinary behaviors. It has lots of names, but the basic underlying understanding, or the basic underpinning of it is any behavior that violates school norms in some way, and not in the explicit ways as in, say, making someone physically less safe because you hit them or bringing a gun to school, but in murkier and less clear ways. So it could be anything from telling a teacher that you're not going to come to their class today to refusing to take off a hat. And so these willful and defiant behaviors, while there has been a reduction in the amount of punishment that schools are able to provide for willful and defiant behaviors, you see the ways in which specifically the understandings of Black girls as aggressive often take their behaviors inside of classrooms and become those willful and defiant behaviors, right? So a girl expressing her opinion or forgetting to raise her hand in class because she's excited, right, about something to say in class, could be understood as insubordination and become a disciplinary violation that leads to her being put in school suspension. It may lead to her being suspended or expelled if the interaction is particularly egregious or if the teacher is particularly experiences it in a particularly exaggerated way. And so you kind of see this increased punishment of Black girls for these willful and defiant behaviors. But it often ends up meaning that Black girls are inadequately supported when they experience things like bullying, right? I work as a representative for students who are suspended and expelled, and I've already seen this happen amongst some of my students, where Black girls who are being aggressively bullied in school, right, being physically beat up, being social media cyberbullied, there's the word, being cyberbullied, are told by schools, because they see Black girls as being more aggressive and more powerful and more able to protect themselves, that they should take things into their own hands, or you should just ignore it, or you should give it up, right? Like that's the response when Black girls are bullied, which means that oftentimes people do take it into their own hands, right? And that's when you see things like fights, like physical altercations that really are one girl trying to protect herself from someone else, but then leads to her being suspended or expelled because she's seen as the primary aggressor the one time she tries to defend herself. But I think the other implication, and probably the most serious implication, is the exaggerated response from school safety personnel. And so in schools that have school resource officers, which are police officers in American schools, this exaggeration of Black female behaviors can become even more extreme, right? Because you now have a cop with a gun inside of a school building. And so, for example, there are a series of stories that came out a couple of years ago about children as young as 5 and 6 being arrested and handcuffed inside of schools for temper tantrums. All of those children were Black girls. Every single one of them was a Black girl. And I would argue that the reason that those girls were handcuffed and arrested at 6 years old, I didn't even think that there were handcuffs that could go on someone that small, for things like throwing toys in a classroom and other temper tantrum behaviors, is because those police officers looked at those little Black girls through the prism of the angry Black woman, and instead saw something that wasn't a child having a tantrum, but rather saw a credible threat to the safety of the people in that classroom. That wasn't true, right? That child wasn't a threat. That any person who's worked with children knows that temper tantrums happen and that the response to them should never, ever be handcuffing a child. And so you kind of see this play out very clearly in terms of how Black girls are punished in school. So the blue column, I guess, because the directions might be different for you all, that in whether you're talking about minor violations, whether you're talking about disobedience, whether you're talking about disruptive behavior, whether you're talking about fighting, whether you're talking about bullying, harassment, and this is in one school district, but this is a trend across the country, Black girls are significantly more likely than white girls to be punished for those behaviors. Realize, though, that there is no research that currently exists that suggests that Black girls engage in these behaviors any more than white girls do. I would argue that what is actually happening is that the behaviors that both groups of girls are engaging in these behaviors, right? So they're both sticking their hand up, they're both forgetting to raise their hand in class. They're both confronting the teacher. They're both fighting, right? But the responses to Black girls are more likely to be the disciplinary responses, and the responses to white girls are the ones where they call your parents and pull you to the side. The second thing that I think is very relevant in terms of the conceptions of Black women and girls uniquely in the school to prison pipeline are kind of the adultification and over-sexualization of Black girls. So the narrative of Black female hypersexuality, much like the narratives of Black female aggression, originate largely from slavery and the justifications for the pretty systematic rape of Black women by white men during slavery and after. One of the ways in which, I guess, people justified this was by arguing that Black women were more sexual, that Black women had deeper sexual desires, were more promiscuous, and therefore it was, I guess, okay to rape them. Or that it was more likely that they would be assaulted. This would continue to be persistent through systematic rape would continue to be persistent through Jim Crow and into the present day. But when you're talking specifically about Black girls, more recent research done by the Georgetown Law Center shows data that adults tend to view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially in the age range of 5 to 14. And at those same stages, they are more knowledgeable about adult topics, especially about sex. This has some pretty serious implications because that's not true, right? When you look at surveys of what youth actually know, it's not necessarily true that they know more, that any group of young people know more about sex, know more about the human body, know more about drug use or any of that. Most kids know the same amount as everyone else, which is largely nothing, considering how bad American sex ed is. But the belief that Black girls particularly know more about sex and are somehow more mature at the same age as their white female counterparts is particularly dangerous because I think it leads to a set of assumptions about the sexuality and the sexual participation of Black girls in the broader world that justifies oftentimes our sexualizing of Black girls in broader society, but realize that it happens pretty generally to Black girls. So very often people tell me that they have no idea how old I am. I look pretty 25 to me. But that cross-racial identification of age is a really big problem when it comes to Black students. So white teachers often have been found to misidentify the ages of Black students by an average of 6 years, right? So that's like seeing a 7-year-old and thinking she might be 12 or 13, which has some pretty serious implications, or actually older than that, which has some pretty serious implications for how you then understand youth behavior. So if you see a child and you think that they should know better and they should be more mature, then your response to them doing something out of line is likely to be more extreme because you see them as more culpable for that behavior. And it has some pretty serious and damaging implications. I think the first implication that is really explicit is what's been identified as the sexual abuse to prison pipeline. Because of their increased sexualization, and well, not exclusively because of, but because of and related to their increased sexualization, Black girls are at a risk for sexual violence and often experience high rates of sexual violence. But because of misrepresentations of their manifestations of trauma, some of it based off of the conceptions that they are more mature and some of it based off of conceptions that they are somehow more aggressive, oftentimes schools misinterpret those behaviors as willful disobedience. So for example, a girl who might be triggered by a loud sound or by the presence of a certain person who experiences that trigger in school might react in a way that is disruptive, that is potentially negative in that school environment, and a teacher who is looking at that Black girl and interpreting her through the prism of her being older or more mature is likely to respond to her in a way that pushes her out, right? So she's like, they're more likely to be like, well, why are you yelling like that? Well, why are you freaking out? Just go to the principal's office, right? That's more likely to be the response than, sweetie, what's going on? Are you okay? What happened to you, right? That concept that we very rarely ask Black girls, what happened to you? And that we more often ask them, what's wrong with you? And send them to principal's offices and later to prisons and jails, instead of sending them to doctor's offices and to mental health supports. I think the other implication is in terms of dress codes and exclusionary discipline. So dress codes in the US are often arbitrarily enforced against Black girls as a way of enforcing gendered and racist narratives of respectability and presentability. So that image of Black women as being more sexual has a lot to do has been heavily built around conceptions of people's physical bodies, right? So the idea that Black women are somehow curvier and more comely has a lot of implications for then how people deal with especially Black teenaged girls, right, as they are entering and going through puberty. So, and this is a personal experience, but I recommend you all click and follow the link below, because there are a million girls who will talk about this. But I went to a school that was a little more diverse than a lot of other schools in the country. And I remember going into school buildings with my white friends, and the white girl next to me and I would have on the same shorts, but I would be sent home an hour to go change my clothes because my shorts violated the dress code, but her shorts, which were the same length, the same type, the same color, did not violate the dress code. And she was allowed to pursue her education and continue the day, right? That story exists across the country for Black girls, and it largely has to do with conceptions of Black bodies as being more sexual than white bodies, and therefore a Black girl wearing shorts is somehow more sexual, right, than a white girl wearing those same shorts. And so all of those sexist narratives about dress codes, which are largely about monitoring girls as a way to control them, play out even worse for Black girls, and realize that in many, many states, dress code violations as a subset of that kind of willful and defiant behavior can be a way by which kids are suspended, right? And so that time out of school is increased simply because of dress code policies, and our conceptions of Black girls is inherently more sexual, even though they're little girls and should be treated as such. I think the final thing is, in my opinion, where dress codes do the most damage, which is in relationship to hair. There's a long history of laws, practices, and beliefs that put restrictions, I didn't finish this in the presentation, that put restrictions on the ways in which Black women present their hair. This is directly related to white supremacist narratives that certain people's hair is more beautiful than other people's hair, and certain people's hair is more presentable than other people's hair. So a series of laws in Louisiana that existed in the 1800s about Black women covering their hair and requiring the Black women wear head wraps, realizing that US military hair regulations until very recently did not include a way for Black women to wear their hairs that didn't require chemical changes to it. And then kind of a persistent cultural conversation, both within Black communities and outside of Black communities, that kinky or kinky hair is ugly or undesirable. And school dress codes tend to continue this tradition because school dress codes are designed, like everything else in the school system, to continue the systems that I was talking about earlier on, right? Thinking about critical theory, the system is designed exactly as it should be working. That school dress codes continue this tradition by banning things like dreadlocks, large afros, cornrows, long braids, right? Things that are oftentimes how people's hair grows naturally out of their head, or minor cultural changes that allow Black women to protect their hair and to grow it to the length that they would like it, right? So all of these things which are natural and almost essential to the health of Black hair, in some school dress codes are literally the sites of, or reasons for suspensions and expulsions. And so what you effectively end up having is very, very directly, specifically directed at Black girls, a aggressive method by which they are suspended and expelled because of who they are. Right? The only other thing that Black girls could do in these instances are things like chemically change their hair, wear wigs, or do other things that are either very expensive or very damaging to themselves in the long term. And so realizing that even though a lot of this presentation is about the subtle and less clear, and that there are very explicit attempts and ways of excluding Black girls from educational spaces that legally exist within school discipline policies and within educational practices more broadly. So, final thing, the movement to change, the movement to return Black girls to schools, and finding and fighting for structural change. So a quick hypothesis of my own, that in the last 10 years, the conversation about school climate has changed drastically. In my lifetime, the conversation about school climate has changed drastically. What I mean by that is that while the punitive environments that I talk about the vast majority of this presentation have existed in inner city schools, predominantly in schools with children who are Black or Latinx, and have had the negative impacts that I've been talking about for all of that time, right? Black and Latinx kids have experienced the negative externalities and the negative impacts of punitive disciplinary environments, hyper-aggressive school reforms, the failure to provide mental health supports, all of those things, for many, many years. And Black communities and Latino communities have spent a lot of time saying that educational quality needs to be improved, that school climate needs to be fixed. But the conversation often fell ignored, right? That it often was something that no one else wanted to talk about, or they blamed the communities themselves, saying that it was something about them intrinsically that led to the fact that their schools were particularly violent or particularly dangerous. As gun violence in American schools begins to impact white communities, see things like Newtown, like Parkland, you've seen a conversation change all of a sudden about school climate, about school safety. And now communities which were perfectly fine with aggressive punitive policies that don't help students and instead push them away from mental health supports are now clamoring for these mental health supports, are now clamoring for the reduce of the amount of guns in the United States. And so I think this is an example of interest convergence very explicitly, that you're seeing some of the rumblings of change that are impacting Black girls and are impacting the movement I've talked about, is one of interest convergence. And to be very careful as I watch, and as you all watch, I guess, these movements grow and develop, to hold people accountable to at the point at which people's interests begin to diverge again, right? As white schools begin to improve, as gun violence reduces in the country, as there are meaningful bans on access to certain types of weapons, that they don't abandon Black kids in schools again and ignore all the forces that I talked about that are not universal, but rather related to race and related to ethnicity. I think that the biggest thing that the movement to ensure the protection of Black girls in schools has done is that kind of looking to the bottom activity that I talked about in the beginning of this presentation. Many of the movements or many of the organizations that have taken up the effort to protect Black girls in schools and to decrease the amount of PUSHOUT that Black girls experience have chosen to center Black girls inside of that movement. So for example, Girls for Gender Equity, which is an organization out of New York, is primarily advised by girls. They are a central part of their governance structure. They are a central part of almost every decision that is made by Girls for Gender Equity. They are at the forefront of their work, and it is they're an essential part of that movement. And I think that a lot of the success that Girls for Gender Equity has seen in New York City schools has been because of that kind of looking to the bottom and making Black girls the center of that movement. But also things like the Let Her Learn campaign, which is run by the National Women's Law Center, which has done a series of very in-depth interviews with Black girls in Washington, D.C., many of them D.C. public school graduates like myself, that are about their experiences of discipline, are about their experiences of school dress code policies, and have very critically been able to center Black girls. And I think the benefit of that is you get really stories that are horrible, but stories that are incredibly powerful, because you then see the girls themselves and you see them explaining their own lives. And I think that's a lot of the reason that you are now seeing some legislative movement on a federal level to curb the amount of Black girls specifically who are suspended and expelled. See things like the PUSHOUT bill, which is being supported by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and quite a few other rather left-leaning legislators. Very briefly, some additional solutions that I think are really important to talk about when we talk about school push-out. The first is increasing support for restorative justice. Like I said, structural changes are the only solution for structural problems. And when we're talking about the structure of discipline in the United States, school discipline in the United States, it is aggressively punitive and it is intended to be so. The way that we undermine that and the way that we change that is by making sure that that is not the policy, but rather one of restorative justice is. So what restorative justice is much more of that asking students, not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So it's much more like doing peer-to-peer mediation, right, when conflicts occur, trust circles and things like that, as opposed to kicking kids out of school and removing them from the building for extended periods of time. And then the piece of advocacy that I've spent quite a bit of time on, which is banning school resource officers. So cops shouldn't be in schools. They just shouldn't. There's tons of research on it. I can talk about it another time, but email me, I can send you all of it. People should not have cops in schools. It doesn't support them. It doesn't facilitate positive development for kids. It's not like it makes them any less likely to do anything inside of schools. It only increases the chances that they get punished very severely for things that are mainly just kids being kids. And then finally, ending zero tolerance discipline policies. So all of those policies that just kind of kick kids out of school. You do one thing and we kick you out and we don't bring you back. That narrative of disposability of children is particularly dangerous and needs to be ended immediately if we have any desire to change the outcomes for Black girls, but also for children as a whole. So that's kind of my presentation. Any questions?
Hi. So thank you for that. It was fascinating and I've learned a lot. So we've actually collected a bunch of questions from the community so that we'll be able to convey them to you. But first before that, if you don't mind, we would like to ask a few questions about you and how you got to the point that you are now. Do you mind sharing a little bit more how you got involved in the study in the first place? You mentioned debate for a second,
Yeah.
Introduction. I'd just like to hear a little more about that.
Yeah. So I got involved. So I've always been involved in Black rights advocacy type work. I started working for the National Coalition on Black Civic Participation when I was 14. I helped run voter registration drives in DC and in Virginia for Black youth. So the racial justice part of my organizing has been a part of my life forever. I'm the child of union organizers, so social justice and organizing also has always been a part of my life. But the piece of my work and the interest that I think I developed in education very specifically came when I was working in Vermont for an organization called Speak. At the time it was called Speak Debate, which was a program started by Jessica Bullock and Luke Dodge, who are University of Vermont alumni, that ran debate trainings and debate programs inside of Vermont prisons and jails. So at the time, they had been running a program in a women's facility that was becoming very successful, and they were expanding to a youth facility. And at that point, I was asked to join because I was studying human development, had a long track record even at that point of working with kids, love working with kids. And so I started working in a prison, and very quickly saw two things. One, Vermont is an incredibly white state. It is overwhelmingly white. I think it's the second whitest state in the country. So being there as a Black girl in and of itself, like a Black girl raised in Washington, D.C., in and of itself, it was bizarre. But what's incredibly bizarre to me is the number of students of color, children of color, that were inside of a prison in Vermont, right? I went in assuming that the vast majority of those kids would be white, and they were not. And it led me to, one, an interest in whether or not people could be adequately educated in prison systems, but kind of a general interest in how we support kids who might end up in prison. And from that, I ended up then working for the Children's Defense Fund, doing a lot of that work, and just kind of kept working towards that, working towards an interest, or working towards an understanding of the ways that children of color are treated inside of education systems, but also kind of in the world more broadly. I kind of think I've at this point, I feel like I have a general interest in kind of like children of color and their experiences, and see myself very explicitly as an advocate for Black children. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing a lot of the research I was doing.
Very interesting. Do you have any recommendations for anyone who is interested into getting to the field in the first place now?
Yeah. So I think I have two. I think one is develop a relationship to the community that you want to talk about, especially if you are not from it. So especially if you're not from a community, you should be hesitant to talking about anyone who's not in the room with you, right? Like that's often just bad etiquette. But I think one of the essential things that I've had to learn is how incredibly personal organizing work and the experiences of oppression are for people, and that you have to have a relationship to that experience. So when I was living in Connecticut, I'm not from Connecticut, right? Like I didn't go to Connecticut public schools. I have no idea what it's like to be a student in Connecticut. And so it became incumbent upon me to have relationships to students in Connecticut. And one of the ways that I did it was I was a reading tutor for kids aged 5 through 9 twice a week. That meant that I knew kids in New Haven, that I had a relationship to them, that when I was lobbying or when I was doing research, that I had, I wasn't just talking about an abstraction, right? I was talking about real people and their experiences. I think that's the first thing kind of generally. I think that if you talk more practically, as I have shifted away from research and more into legal work, I think what's really important for people to think about in terms of their careers is what piece of the work to improve the lives of children, to improve the lives of people in society, do you want to be a part of? Because I think that I entered my career thinking that I wanted to be a researcher, and that the piece of the work that I wanted was to answer questions for people and to answer questions for myself. And I realized very quickly that that work was not the work for me. And so I think, and at first I was really worried, because I was like, what space then do I have in this community? What space then do I have in this conversation if it's not this? And I think it's thinking very holistically about the ways in which you can, the parts that you can play inside of movements, right? So not everyone wants to be up front. Like I particularly do not, right? I really like doing the more coalitional type work. So helping people build relationships, helping organizations act out their own missions. And so I think that one, thinking that you are going to be out front the first day is probably untrue, right? Organizing movements are often hierarchical, even though they shouldn't be, but also there are people with much deeper expertise, even though it's not like a PhD type expertise, that are often in the front of those movements that are really essential, but also that there are a million ways to support the work of making the world a better place, whether that's for children or the environment, or improving criminal justice systems or whatever it is, and that you need to find the place where you can mobilize your skills the best inside of that work, as opposed to simply doing the loudest, biggest thing that you can think of.
That makes a lot of sense. You're a JD candidate in the NYU Law School. Do you have any recommendations for someone who might want to also start a legal track, or to even get started to law school in particular?
Yeah, think long and hard. Law school, especially if you're going in the US, law school is expensive. Like, Lord have mercy, I am bleeding money. Like, I literally just am bleeding money. And it's not, like, it's hard. I didn't expect it to be as hard as it was. I think I expected it to be hard, but it is much, much harder than I thought it would be. And so I think, ask yourself, like I said before, if the law is really the vehicle that you yourself would like to use to change things. Because if it's not, right, if there are other vehicles that you would like to use, then please do those. If you think that, and also that that's not the only way to be an advocate, right? I think that a lot of people see lawyers as like the only way to be an attorney. And I think my best advice to people who want to be lawyers, especially if you want to be an advocate for other people, is to consider all of the other ways first that you can be an advocate, right? So social workers are advocates for other people, organizers are advocates for other people, oftentimes in situations that require a lot less drama than going to law school. But if you love the law like I do, then go. Like, really, like, if you actually enjoy talking about the law or talking about the ways in which legal systems particularly interact, by all means, law school is the best option for everyone. But the first step should just ask yourself, is the law actually the thing I want to be involved in? Because if it's not, don't do it.
That's a very fair response. You mentioned how debating pushed you into being more upfront and advocate. Do you think that you're still using the skill set that you've gotten from debating in your current positions?
Oh, certainly. I think that the public speaking skills, although like the way in which we speak in debate is probably not the best like actual communication tool, but I think that the ways in which debate gives you the knowledge that you can speak extemporaneously, that you can take information, especially when you're talking about BP and you have 15 minutes of prep, that you can take information and kind of turn that out really quickly, can give people a lot of confidence. But I think that one of the things that I've learned probably best from debate is how to understand people's arguments. I think especially in like the current political climate in the US, there are a lot of arguments. There are a lot of people saying things, and at least quite a few of them seem plausible on face. And I think a lot of people, when confronted with competing sets of facts, when confronted with competing sets of values, don't always have a way of analyzing those things, or like almost a systematic way of understanding the things that they're being confronted with. And I've always felt very grateful to debate that, like, I can see a red herring, right? Like, I can see when someone is not answering the question directly. It's very hard for me to watch things like presidential debates for that reason, right? Because I think the best thing debate gives you is an ability to kind of resist people trying to pull the wool over your eyes.
It makes a lot of sense, and every time that we speak about the value of debating, I see the audience that we have start to smile. So it's very pleasant to see that happen. So it's like, yeah, the activity has value even after you finish with it.
It does, yeah.
Would you change anything in your trajectory so far that you think would have placed you in a better position to handle the challenges that you're currently facing?
That's interesting. I think as someone who, this is like a weird answer, but I think this might help somebody, I don't know. I think that spending more time thinking in my undergraduate studies, thinking about political theory would have been very useful to me. I studied human development, which means that the vast majority of my coursework was in child development, so biology classes, child development classes, social work, things like that. Those are incredibly useful, and I recommend that people take at least one of those classes because, one, you will probably become a parent one day and need to know something about child development, but also because I think that it teaches you a lot about how people relate to one another, and is a hidden skill that very few people have. But I think that as I moved into work that was much more structural and much more about the broader conversations that happen in our world and not just individual children learning and growing, that I wished I had taken like an intro to poli-sci, that I wish I had taken more of those kind of like foundational, like social studies type courses, social sciences type courses, because it was a learning curve. I had to literally go back and basically learn those things myself, or just kind of like pick them up from random stuff I had learned in debate. But especially if you're someone who has started off in a more helping profession and you're thinking of moving into policy and moving into advocacy, that take some time and learn some theory. It will certainly help you.
That's very interesting. Do you mind sharing your future plans with us? You know, are you thinking about what you're going to do after law school and where you're going to focus your endeavors?
Yeah. So I hope to become a civil rights attorney, which is probably not very surprising. Yeah, I hope to be a civil rights attorney. I have a dream of working for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Who knows if that will ever happen. But I hope to continue to do legal work around ensuring that kids are treated adequate, kids of color, especially Black kids, are treated with decency and with adequacy inside of their schools. And so for the next year, I will be helping to, or supporting running a the suspension representation project, which is, I guess, my first step, which provides advocacy for kids in New York City schools who have been suspended. And so that's kind of the first step into becoming the head of the NAACP one day.
I'm counting on you. So we've gotten a few questions from the community regarding the content of what you've presented us in the presentation. So a member of the community wondered if you think some of the conclusions of your research can be applicable to inequalities that we're facing inside the debate community. For example, if I'm a president of a debate club, is there something concrete that you can suggest from your research that would potentially be valuable to increase representation?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. I think that one, in some of them are kind of equity team focused, and then some of them are kind of thinking about bias in rounds and the ways in which we see people. So I think in terms of equity and the way that in which we prepare equity teams, I think a lot of the pieces of my research that are about the ways in which stereotypes end up impacting the perceptions of people that we have in rounds is really important. So I was the equity officer for USUDC alongside Rob Ruiz and Clarence Bronte for 2 years ago now. And one of the things that we did prior to the tournament was circulate information and conversations about implicit bias and the ways that implicit bias end up impacting how people could interact with people in a debate round. I think that's really important to norm people on the concept of implicit bias. To the extent to which that reduces their bias, we don't really entirely know. And there's a lot of research about whether or not telling people about biases makes them better or worse. But I think it is useful to begin that conversation within debating communities about the ways that we see people, and how our stereotypes, especially realizing that the debate community is so diverse and so large that oftentimes people come with stereotypes of people from places that are all the way across the world that they have no interaction with. And so norming people on the fact that those stereotypes are often not true or are not true, right? And that they oftentimes have very harmful implications and harmful sources are really important. I think that in terms of judges, I think this is a much more explicit call for judges to check themselves when they interact with Black women. I have had far too many experiences, and trust me, don't go asking every Black woman in the debate community and harassing them, please. But many, many Black women in the debate community could come and tell the exact same stories that I have told about people hearing my speeches and being like, well, that was very aggressive. And I was like, I didn't even speak that loudly. Like, I was speaking barely above a whisper. Like, and the fact that as a debater, I had to learn to modulate my voice in a very extreme way, seeking this like little high-pitched voice to get people to listen to me. And it took me a very long time to just not care and speak with my real voice. And that there was a real impact on me because of that, on my emotional development, on my development as a debater. But also, I think it's incumbent, especially on judges who've been judging for a long time and occupy especially powerful places inside of the debating community, to understand the systems of oppression that they might be interacting. The lack of willingness to understand marginalization of Black people that I think exists in debate is dangerous, because it means that there are a lot of judges who are walking around interacting with Black women in debating spaces, perceiving them as aggressive and acting upon them for that. That has an impact on people's speaker points. That has an impact on whether you're the 2 or the 3 in the round, right? When we think about manner. And so realizing that all of those stereotypes and all of the negativity that is directed at Black women is very virulent in the debate community, and very alive. And I think that the first step is naming that, and not just here, but in other spaces, naming that very critically and very explicitly, and hopefully giving Black women who've been in debate some space to talk about that and to communicate that as well.
It's very insightful. Another member of the community wanted us to ask, what tools do you believe that schools have at their disposal in order to make sure that many of the problems are going to be mitigated? So, you have talked about, at the very end, a few other alternatives or additional policies. Do you think that there are particular ones that are specifically potentially going to have a lot of impact? Do you have like a way to rank the ability? Do you think that all of them are equally important?
So I think it's hard in the US educational context, because this is one problem in a dumpster fire of problems. It's like really hard. It's like the US education system has a range of issues that are very deep. The main one is that many schools are aggressively underfunded. And so a lot of the things that I talk about, say removing school resource officers, reducing the amount of punitive discipline and replacing it with more restorative policies, need money. Like, to be able to support a positive school climate, you need to be able to pay a guidance counselor, someone with a upper level degree, right, that can support students. And a cop is honestly sometimes cheaper. And so realizing that a lot of the problems that I'm talking about are very linked to the resource deprivation in lots and lots of schools, and are exacerbated by resource deprivation. But if I had to pick any of those things, that if I was like queen for a day, I would do, is ending zero tolerance discipline policies. Zero tolerance discipline policies are new when you consider like American disciplinary history. They are a creation of the 90s and the Gun-Free Schools Act, and have permeated almost every other part of the discipline code. There are zero tolerance policies on all kinds of things across the country that you're just like, there's no reason you should be expelled for that. And also realizing that even when we're talking about more serious violations, so a child bringing a gun to school, that's scary and that's terrifying. I agree. But at the same time, if a child is bringing a gun to school, we have a big problem on our hands when it comes to that kid. There's a serious reason that they brought that gun to school. Either they feel unsafe and they're bringing that gun to school, or they want to harm somebody, and that's a display of a behavior that could be curbed, right? Like, children are malleable, there is potential with them, and so this belief that children are disposable, the zero tolerance policy suggests that you can dispose of children, that there's a point at which you can just kick them out into the world, right? from a place that is legally theirs, right? There's a space meant for children and created for children. And so I think if that was the one thing I do, it would be to end zero tolerance policies.
This is extremely useful, and I think that if anyone is listening, it's very good because it gives a very concrete goal of what to advocate for. On a personal note, I'm also willing to 100% back you being queen for a day or even longer. So another member had a question specifically. You have opinions on affirmative action policies. Do you think that they provide good solutions in order to ensure representation, or are you opposed to them?
I support affirmative action policies. I always have. I think that they should be stronger. I think that when you look at like the impacts of the quota system in California when it existed, like the UC system, the University of California system was incredibly diverse. It is less diverse than it was before. It's always going to be diverse because it's California, but it's less diverse, right? Like you can see the implications of the rollbacks of affirmative action policies. Do I think that affirmative action policies are the only things that are a part of the solving of racialized issues in the US? Absolutely not. Simply placing kids, right? I was a Black kid in a predominantly white university. Simply placing Black kids or kids of color in predominantly white spaces is not progress in and of itself. One, we often put those young people at risk for significant abuse in those spaces, but also that doesn't guarantee that we've lifted up entire communities. So affirmative action is an essential part of rectifying the wrongs of racism, but it is not the only piece of that story, and certainly can't be the only one we're focused on. Also, in the US, it doesn't really exist anymore. So, like, as you know, we've done away with any true affirmative action. So, like, whatever implications we can see are just kind of like fleeting question marks.
That is a strong defense. I'll open the stage. We have a live audience here. A few people that have been very patient, and it seems that they also want to ask a few questions. So I'll moderate, and if you have questions, just please raise your hand, and I'll let you ask it. So yeah, Lilach, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk and for your work. It's been very interesting listening to you. Just one point on what you just said in response to the previous question and then a question. So there's this joke that being a fiscal conservative in the US means you're against the government spending money on anything that's not the military, tax exempts for the ultra rich, and incarceration. And I think that it's important to remember that yes, having a police officer might be cheaper than having a guidance counselor, but it's both short-term and long-term. Imprisoning children is very expensive, and that's like putting aside all the like principled objections. And then to my question, so as a trans queer feminist activist, I am very interested in promoting the idea or correcting the misconception that cisgendered people don't have gender, and specifically that men don't have gender. And specifically, while listening to you, you mentioned this is not your area, but I was very interested specifically in the way that the construction of American Black masculinity affects both imprisonment and education. So if you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think so there's a lot of really, really good research, and I can send it to you on how Black masculinity interacts with American schools. I think in some ways, the narratives of aggression are very similar to the narratives of aggression that I talked about when it comes to Black women. I think there are two really important realizations. one, there is a significant and persistent set of structures throughout American history, very, very explicitly directed at the incarceration and attempts to control Black men and boys, right? I would be remiss in talking today if I didn't mention Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed now 3 months ago, but his perpetrators were just arrested. While jogging, two white men saw him, thought that he might have been someone who committed a robbery in the past, tracked him down and shot him, claiming that they were trying to protect themselves, but clearly just wanted to kill a Black man. And that the threat of Black men and the risks that Black men are claimed to pose to society are endemic in America's narrative of itself, and it's a narrative of its criminal justice system. And that it creates some pretty horrific experiences for Black boys. Black boys inside of schools, like I said before, are the largest group of people who are suspended and expelled from schools. And because of that experience, horrific educational outcomes. When they are in schools, they often experience similar types of marginalization as Black girls. And it ruins people's lives, right? Like that type of belief that Black men are hyper-aggressive, the belief that Black men are less intelligent, the belief that Black men are more sexual, right? All of those things end up being pushed upon Black boys in the same way that some of those narratives are pushed upon Black girls, often to some of the worst results.
Very insightful answer. Do you have another question from the audience? Amira, go ahead.
Yeah, so Camara, thank you so much for that talk. It was very, very insightful, super helpful for not just debating, but I think just like general understanding in life. My question is, given that in society, it's very common, like there's this norm where women are told like, or just the fact that women have to work twice as hard in order to get the same recognition as a man, given your research with Black feminism theory and your work with the youth, do you think it's okay for young girls coming from minority groups to be taught not just to work twice as hard because of the gendered aspect, but also now needing to be a lot more vocal and unapologetic in comparison to their white counterparts, given the kind of racial dynamics that exists in the classroom setting?
I think that it's essential too. I think that it's essential to communicate to girls of color, specifically to Black girls, one, the reasons that they're experiencing the things that they are. When I was in Connecticut, I spent quite a bit of time traveling around the state doing presentations about disparities in school discipline. And some of that was because I think that people should understand what's happening to them and why it's happening. And so that older women of color need to make sure that girls understand the structures that are oppressing them, and that they also, I think so to answer the initial question, I think the twice as hard narrative, like I heard that too growing up. Like that's a common Black parent narrative as well, right? You have to work twice as hard to be half as good. And growing up as a Black woman, right, I got that and a whole other set of narratives about presentability and about access to professional spaces being a Black woman as well. And I think that those narratives presented to people uncritically can be very damaging, right? The concept that there's something about you intrinsically that means you have to work twice as hard is pretty damaging to kids. And I think it can create some pretty odd conceptions about race, right? So like a lot of people walking around like believing that like Black achievement is possible or like minority achievement is possible, but only if you assimilate, right? Like a lot of those have to do with kind of those like subtle inferiority narratives that we suggest to kids when we say twice as hard, half as good. But I think that you do have to present that to people as a reality though, because it is one, right? Like it is true that, and I've seen it play out in my own life, that I can put in twice as much work. I could give the same debate speech, right, as my white male counterpart, and somehow all of it is credited to him as if I spoke not a single word in the round, right? And so I think it's true. And what we have to do is ensure that girls of color, Black girls especially, know that that reality is true, but that reality isn't because of them. It is because of something far more structural and something that they can fight and that they can be a part of changing themselves, right? That it doesn't just have to happen to you. You don't just have to work hard. You can work hard and tear this whole thing down and make sure that your daughter doesn't have to work twice as hard too.
It's very interesting. Do we have another question from the audience? Yeah, Nadav, go ahead.
Hi. So in the section where you talked about intersectionality, I understood that basically we see each person as kind of a composite of their identity, which is unique because it is a composite of several identities. But at the same time, there are certain systems that affect or different kind of identities, or even systems that overlap in how they affect different kind of people. And the way that, as far as I understand it, in feminism today, there is a lot of talk about how just because you're from a certain group doesn't mean you shouldn't care about the other group because you're both might be affected by the same system. The question I'm trying to raise here is that given that there might be a similar system affecting both groups, and yet each group within itself is unique because they are a different composite, what is kind of the balance? I mean, how much should each group take care of its own problem that are unique to itself, and how much should it care for problems that are affecting other groups just because there is some overlapping?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I think that it's one that social movements struggle with worldwide. I've watched Black rights movement struggle with it as it relates to Black queer people, as it relates to Black women, as it relates to, and it's true across most other social movements, most other identity movements, that you begin to very quickly to interact with people's other identities that are not the one identity that you're talking about. And I think that the remedy to that is in seeing all of these things, all of the kind of more piecemeal experiences of oppression as a part of a broader whole system of oppression, right? And so what I mean by that is that patriarchy, white supremacy, capitalism, ableism, right? All of those systems or all of those ideologies and the systems that are built off of them, obviously interact in very, very clear and very explicit ways, and that it is useful for organizations to see their work as a part of dismantling the broader whole, as opposed to working on individual issues, right? So for example, like I said before, a lot of my work focuses on Black children and families, but I see that as a piece of a broader movement to disrupt systems of white supremacism, right? White supremacy and capitalism, right? And so in some ways that helps me negotiate my relationships with other people, say people who are working on issues related to Black adults, Black elders, people like that. And it helps me to mediate those relationships and kind of decide the moments at which we team up and maybe the moments in which we deviate. And so I think having a broad structural understanding of why you are doing your work and what the goals of that work is outside of just like, I want this thing now, which I don't think movements actually do, like that's reductive, but like outside of kind of like a more narrowed focus of like, I would like to close youth prisons, right? Like that's a narrow focus. I think there is a broader focus that then is the general system of incarceration in the United States and broadly in the world is one that is, one, dangerous to outcomes, but two, probably one that is not. You know, do you see what I mean? And it helps you to kind of negotiate those relationships a little bit more cleanly, to the extent to which you'll ever be able to negotiate any of those relationships cleanly.
Okay, very, very interesting. We'll have like last one or two questions from the audience if you have anything else that you want to ask. Okay, so I'll ask one for me. Is there anything that I assume there are many things during your many years of research and many years of advocacy that you've changed your mind about, that a conception that you held in the beginning, but then you found it wrong. Would you mind sharing what was that and how do you change your mind about it later on?
So I think, actually, you know what's interesting is I just had this conversation with someone recently about like, yeah, so I think coming into this work, from a position of working with children and for children and being from the family that I'm from, I have a very, very, very punitive view of people who harm children. Very, very punitive. I think my natural instinct is that people who cause harm to children should receive the harshest punishments available. I think as I have grown and developed in my understanding of prisons and my understanding of systems of incarceration, I see now, firstly, that the system that we have isn't one that really considers children to begin with. So if I'm supporting the current criminal justice system because I think that children are being protected and we're punishing abusers, we're not, largely because those abusers were in our system at the point at which we began to consider children, right? And so a lot of the things that could have protected kids legally don't really exist. And secondarily, that the harsh punishments that I want to see for people who harm children are very, very frequently not the way to ensure that that harm never happens again, right? I think that one of the biggest parts of criminal justice work and juvenile justice work that I've taken out of it is, while retribution is very satisfying as a concept, like the idea of getting back is really satisfying, that it very infrequently leads to positive outcomes, right? So ensuring that people who abuse their children get therapy and get support and get economic support and all the things they need to do to not abuse their children again is far more useful and far more likely to protect those kids in the future than simply throwing that person in jail and separating them from their child forever. And so I think that for me, that was one of the biggest transitions, was in my understanding and how we deal with people who harm children and what relationship that has to kind of my broader understandings of criminal and juvenile justice.
It's fascinating. So, so I'll take Lilach, and then that will be the last question. So go ahead, Lilach.
So one thing that has to do with a kind of a different debate that I'm interested in also as a person who made the mistake of going to law school is question, and an activist, is the question of working from within the system, so kind of reform action as opposed to more radical or revolutionary action. And this is especially interesting. I think it's a debate that can be held in very different backgrounds, but I'm interested specifically in the background of prison abolition and the stance that some Black African-American organizations has taken against working with the American criminal justice system on the one hand, and then the work that is done by other organizations, as you have mentioned yourself being a part of working with prisoners within these prisons. So just kind of more generally, how do you settle the principled objection to incarceration as a method with having to work with the system?
It's hard. I really struggle to. I struggle with it every day. I spend a lot of time thinking about my relationship now to the structures that I'm talking about, right? Like, especially choosing to become an attorney, right? I think very, very specifically, choosing to become an attorney places you very squarely within that structure, right? Especially if you choose to get licensed, right? Like you in some ways are seeking a formal recognition of your professional abilities from a structure that you say is illegitimate and shouldn't exist. And I don't know what I'm going to do with that when I graduate, to be perfectly honest. My parents would be very mad if I don't become a practicing attorney. So fear of parents might be a factor for a lot of people. But I think that you can choose to see, or one of the ways I choose to see it when I want to sleep at night is in the way that I think the Black Panther Party kind of tries to explain it. The Black Panther Party had kind of two prongs to the work that they did. They had the more revolutionary prong, which was about mobilizing Black communities to create more protective, more affirming defenses of Black communities, right? So things like driving around and monitoring the police, being armed, right? Training communities for militant behavior and militant action was an essential part of the revolutionary arm of the Black Panther Party. But at the same time, they realized that you couldn't just leave people in the lurch in the status quo, right? You couldn't just like say, time to fight for the revolution, everybody, when Black communities were experiencing massive amounts of food insecurity, when things like sickle cell anemia were ravaging Black communities, especially in LA, where the Black Panther Party was started, right? So realizing that you have to do some of that community sustaining work at the same time as you are fighting for a revolution. And so I see my legal work in some ways as that kind of mitigatory work, that it is, while I am trying to convince people that the entire education structure is wrong and that we need something very, very different to be able to ensure kids' lives result positively and that kids are happy and healthy and safe and treated decently in schools, while we are creating that structure, we can't just simply let kids languish and die being suspended and expelled, right? We have to make it as good as we possibly can for people. One, because those people will fight for us if we do, but two, because it's the only right thing to do if you actually care about the groups that you're talking about, is to not just simply say, the only thing exists is the future. I think that comes from a lot of privilege, and that maybe my legal work is much more about the here and the now than it is about the future that I hope for all kids.
It's a very interesting response, and thank you for reflecting the complexity. To wrap things up on an activist note, for the individuals who are hearing and want to do something but may not have a lot of resources, a lot of money or free time, but still want to help, do you have any recommendation to what still can be done, also realistically, because of all of the problems and new constraints that we are facing at the time of COVID-19 worldwide?
Yes.
Yeah.
So right now it's a bit hard because everything is on hold. Like when I say the whole world is, I mean, you all know, obviously the whole world has stopped, as it should, and everyone needs to stay inside. But I think continuing to build your knowledge and your understanding of this area, right? So my presentation is not the beginning nor the end of this conversation. There is a lot of research. It is constant. It is growing. Monique Morris, the woman who wrote the book PUSHOUT, also did a documentary to go alongside with it. I think it is on Netflix. If not, I will link the Amazon link here. And I recommend people watch that. I think that, I really can't think of anything right in the here and now, mainly because just everything has stopped and school has stopped. So to be perfectly honest, no one knows what's going on in American schools right now. Things are kind of wild. The Suspension Representation Project that I work for has discovered that all of the suspension proceedings have effectively just been like put on pause. And so there are a whole bunch of kids who like may be suspended, may be expelled. We don't really, we really don't know what's happening to kids right now. And so, bumping your American friends' posts about things is really useful in terms of getting awareness. Y'all know I always beg for people to bump my stuff. But I think just kind of increasing your knowledge, I will be sure to include all of the resources I talked about in like a link or in like a resource list after this.
That will be phenomenal. Unfortunately, we have to end, even though I can imagine talking to you for many more hours, because it was really eye-opening and very, very, very interesting throughout the entire time. Thank you very much for agreeing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk with us. We are going to have all of the links and the presentation in the notes. And if you've enjoyed and if you've listened and enjoyed to this content, you can also subscribe to the channel to hear other speakers talk with us about interesting and important things in the world. And just genuinely a heartfelt thank from all of us. And it was a pleasure talking with you.